exciting conclusion of the last lessons of Ms Vesper. Part 2. The basement was dimly lit by candles, dozens of them arranged in a perfect circle on the floor. The flickering flames created dancing shadows on the walls, but it was clear enough to see what was happening. 3 figures stood in the corner of the room, perfectly still, their arms hanging limply at their sides. Even from this distance and through the dirty glass, the boys could recognize them. Mark, Sherry, Lynn. All 3 students stood motionless, their faces slack and expressionless. Their skin looked wrong, too pale, almost grey in the candlelight. Their clothes were dirty and dishevelled, and they stared straight ahead with empty eyes, as if they were sleepwalking or hypnotized. "Oh my God," Luke whispered. "What happened to them?" David's hands were shaking as he gripped the window ledge. "We have to get them out of there. We have to—" "Wait," Matt interrupted. "Someone's coming?" They heard footsteps on the stairs, slow, measured steps that seemed to echo in the confined space. A shadow fell across the candlelit basement, growing larger as its source descended. Ms Vesper appeared at the bottom of the stairs. She moved with that same floating gait, her feet barely touching the steps. She wore the same dark sweater and dress, and her long black hair hung around her face like a funeral shroud. But here, in this place, she looked different. More real, somehow. More present. And infinitely more terrifying. She paused at the bottom of the stairs, her head tilting as she regarded the 3 motionless students. Then, with deliberate slowness, she began to move toward the corner of the room, the corner the boys couldn't see from their vantage point. The 3 friends pressed closer to the window, trying to get a better angle. They heard Ms Vesper begin to speak, but the words were in no language they'd ever heard. The sounds were harsh and guttural, full of consonants that seemed to scrape against the throat. The temperature seemed to drop even outside the house, and the boy's breath began to steam in the suddenly frigid air. As Ms Vesper continued her strange chanting, a fog began to fill the basement. It came from nowhere, materializing out of the very air itself, thick and grey and unnatural. It rolled across the floor like a living thing, rising higher and higher until it obscured the 3 students from view. Matt leaned harder against the window, trying to see through the fog. His hand pressed against the rotted wood frame, and with a sudden crack that seemed impossibly loud in the evening quiet, the old window gave way. The window swung outward on rusty hinges, and Matt, who had been putting all his weight against it, lost his balance. He tumbled forward with a yelp of surprise and terror, falling headfirst through the opening and into the basement below. He hit the concrete floor with a thud that knocked the wind from his lungs. For a moment, he lay there stunned, trying to remember how to breathe. Then he heard his friends calling his name. "Matt! Matt, are you okay?" David and Luke were leaning through the open window, their arms stretched down toward him. Matt scrambled to his feet, ignoring the pain in his shoulder and ribs. He reached up toward his friend's outstretched hands, his fingers stretching for theirs. Then he felt something behind him, a presence, a coldness that made his bones ache. Ms Vesper appeared out of the fog like a nightmare-given form. Her face was no longer expressionless. Instead, it was twisted with fury and something else, hunger. Her eyes had changed completely, becoming solid black orbs that reflected the candlelight like dark mirrors. When she opened her mouth, they could see her teeth, too white, too sharp, too many of them. "Foolish boy," she hissed, her voice layered with harmonics that hurt to hear. "You have delivered yourself to me." Her hand shot out with impossible speed, grabbing Matt's arm with fingers that felt like ice-cold iron. Matt screamed, trying to pull away, but her grip was inhumanly strong. She yanked him backward, away from the window and his friend's desperate grasping hands. The fog intensified, pouring from the corners of the room in thick waves. Within seconds, the entire basement disappeared from view. The last thing David and Luke saw was Ms Vesper's black eyes staring directly at them through the swirling grey, and Matt's face twisted in terror as he was pulled into the darkness. Then there was nothing, just fog and the echo of Matt's screams. "Matt!" David screamed, reaching farther into the window. "Matt!" Luke grabbed David's arm. "We have to go. We have to get help." "We can't leave him," David sobbed, tears streaming down his face. "We can't help him if she gets us too." Luke pulled harder, dragging David away from the window. They stumbled backward, and that's when they saw her. Ms Vesper stood on the front porch of the house, perfectly still, perfectly calm. Somehow, impossibly, she had moved from the basement to the front of the house in seconds. She stood in the doorway, watching them, her black eyes reflecting the dying light of day. Behind her, grey fog poured from the open door like smoke from a burning building, rolling down the steps and across the lawn. The sight broke whatever paralysis had gripped the boys. They ran. They grabbed their bikes from where they'd dropped them and pedalled frantically, not looking back, not speaking, just pumping their legs as hard as they could. The sun was setting now, casting the streets in bloody orange light, and every shadow seemed to hide something terrible. David looked back once, just once. Ms Vesper still stood on the porch, motionless, watching them flee. The fog continued to pour from the house behind her, creating a grey backdrop against which her dark figure was perfectly silhouetted. They didn't stop pedalling until they reached David's house. David's home was a ranch-style house in a newer development, the kind of place with a well-maintained lawn and cheerful flower boxes in the windows. The normalcy of it seemed almost obscene after what they'd just witnessed. They threw their bikes on the front lawn and burst through the door, gasping for breath, their faces flushed with exertion and fear. David's parents were both out, his mum at book club and his dad working late, leaving them alone in the empty house. They stumbled into the living room and collapsed on the couch, their bodies shaking with adrenaline and terror. For several long minutes, neither of them could speak. They just sat there, breathing hard, their minds struggling to process what they'd seen. Finally, Luke broke the silence. "She has Matt," he said, his voice hollow. "She has all of them." "What? What is she?" David ran his hands through his hair, pulling hard enough to hurt. "I don't know. Some kind of witch? Monster? Did you see her eyes?" "And her teeth," Luke added, shuddering. "She's not human. She can't be human." "We have to call the cops," David said, reaching for the phone on the side table. "We have to tell someone what's happening." "And say what?" Luke asked, his voice rising. "That our substitute teacher is a monster who kidnapped our classmates, that she has them in her basement doing some kind of weird ritual. They'll think we're crazy. They'll think we're making it up." David held the phone receiver in his hand, his finger hovering over the buttons. Luke was right. Who would believe them? A substitute teacher who was actually some kind of creature, students held captive in a haunted house on Blackwood Lane. It sounded like a campfire story, not reality. "But we have to do something," David said desperately. "We can't just leave them there. Matt is our friend. Mark and Sherry and Lynn, they're our classmates. We can't abandon them." Luke stood up and began pacing the room, his mind racing. You're right, but the cops will take too long. They'll want statements, they'll need warrants, they'll have to convince their captain or whatever. By the time they actually do something, it might be too late. What are you saying? Luke stopped pacing and turned to face David, his jaw set with determination. I'm saying we have to go back. We have to get them out ourselves. Tonight. Now. Are you insane? David asked, but even as he said it, he knew Luke was right. We're just kids. What can we do against whatever she is? We're smart kids, Luke said firmly, and we have the element of surprise. She thinks we ran away scared. She doesn't expect us to come back. We grab the others and get out before she knows what's happening. David thought about Matt, his best friend since kindergarten, trapped in that foggy basement with those terrible black eyes staring at him. He thought about how scared Matt must be, how confused and terrified. Could he really just sit here and wait for adults to maybe, possibly, help? Okay, David said finally. Okay, we go back. But we need weapons or something. Some way to defend ourselves. Luke's eyes lit up with sudden inspiration. Does your mum still have that pepper spray she keeps in her purse? Yeah, in the kitchen. Why? Pepper spray is basically just concentrated capsaicin, the stuff that makes peppers hot. It hurts like crazy. Maybe we can use it against her, slow her down long enough to grab everyone and run. David nodded, already moving toward the kitchen. Good idea. What else? Luke followed him, scanning the counters and cabinets with the focused intensity of someone planning a battle. His eyes landed on a can of aerosol hairspray and a package of long fireplace matches sitting next to the stove. Dude, he said slowly, a plan forming in his mind. Do you remember that video we watched in science class? About flammable gases? David turned from where he was digging through his mother's purse. You mean the one where Mr. Patterson sprayed hairspray through a lighter and made a fireball? Exactly. Luke grabbed the hairspray and matches. We can make a flamethrower, a small one, but still. Fire is like the ultimate weapon against monsters, right? That's how it works in every horror movie. David found his mother's pepper spray, a small red canister attached to her keychain. He pocketed it and looked at Luke's improvised weapon with a mixture of admiration and terror. This is either the smartest or the stupidest thing we've ever done, David said. Probably both, Luke admitted. But we're doing it anyway. For Matt. For Matt, David echoed. They gathered their weapons, checked to make sure everything worked. Luke practiced with the lighter and hairspray in the sink, creating a small but impressive burst of flame, and then headed back outside to their bikes. The sun had fully set now. Blackwood Lane would be dark. They pedalled through the streets as dusk turned to night, their bike lights cutting pale swaths through the growing darkness. Every shadow seemed menacing now, every sound suspicious. But they didn't stop, didn't hesitate. Their friend needed them. When they arrived at 1847 Blackwood Lane, the house looked even more sinister in the darkness. A single dim light glowed in one of the upper windows, but otherwise the structure was dark and silent. The fog had dissipated, but a strange smell hung in the air. Something chemical and wrong, like sulfur mixed with decay. They dismounted their bikes a safe distance away and approached on foot, moving quietly across the overgrown lawn. The basement window had already been boarded up, a fresh piece of plywood hammered over the opening, still oozing with the smell of new lumber. She knew we might come back, Luke whispered. She's prepared. They tried the front door first, David wrapped his hand in his shirt to muffle the sound and turned the doorknob as gently as possible. Locked. Of course it was locked. They crept around to the back of the house, moving through waist-high weeds and around abandoned gardening equipment. The back door was also locked, but there was a window set into the door itself, old glass, divided into 4 small panes. Luke looked around until he found a sturdy stick among the debris. He tested its weight, then looked at David. "Ready?" he whispered. David nodded, gripping the pepper spray tighter. Luke swung the stick with all his strength. The glass shattered with a crash that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night. They both froze, waiting for some response from inside the house, but none came. After a heart-pounding minute, Luke carefully reached through the broken window, mindful of the jagged edges, and felt around until he found the deadbolt. It turned easily, and the door swung open with a long, horror movie creak. "David, come on!" Luke hissed, and they slipped inside. They found themselves in a narrow hallway that smelled of must and neglect. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper that might have been floral once, but had deteriorated into abstract patterns of rot and mould. The floor creaked beneath their feet, no matter how carefully they walked. It didn't take long to find the basement stairs. They descended slowly, testing each step before putting their full weight on it. The stairs groaned and popped, broadcasting their arrival to anyone who might be listening. The basement was still full of fog, though not as thick as before. It clung to the floor and walls like morning mist, obscuring their vision and muffling sound. The candles had burned down to stubs, providing only the faintest flickering light. But it was enough to see the corner where they'd spotted the students earlier. They were all there, Mark, Sherry, Lynn, and now Matt. All 4 stood in a line, perfectly still, their arms at their sides and their faces blank. In the dim light, David could see something that made his blood run cold. Each of them had 2 small puncture wounds on their neck, just above the collar. Fresh blood had trickled down and dried on their skin. "Oh God," David breathed. "She bit them. She actually bit them." "Vampire," Luke said, the word coming out as barely a whisper. "She's a vampire." It was the only explanation that made sense. The floating walk, the inability to enter without being invited. But the principal had invited her into the school, hadn't he? The pale skin, the black eyes, the sharp teeth. Ms Vesper was a vampire, and she'd been feeding on her students. They rushed forward, no longer worried about stealth. Matt, wake up!" David shook his friend's shoulders, but Matt just stared straight ahead, with glassy, unseeing eyes. "Snap out of it." Luke was shaking Mark, while David moved to the girls. "Lynn, Sherry, can you hear me?" The 4 students began to stir slowly, like people waking from a deep sleep. Their eyes fluttered and focused, confusion replacing the blank expressions. What's going on?" Matt mumbled, his words slurred. "Where am I?" "We're getting you out of here," David said urgently. "Can you walk?" I think so." Matt took a shaky step forward, then another. The others were waking up too, their movements uncoordinated and confused. Mark touched the wounds on his neck and looked at his bloody fingers in horror. "What happened to me?" he asked, his voice trembling with fear and confusion. Before anyone could answer, a sound cut through the fog-filled basement, a shriek so powerful and inhuman that it seemed to vibrate in their chest cavities. It was the sound of pure rage, of a predator discovering its prey had been disturbed. Ms Vesper materialized from the shadows in the far corner of the basement, the corner they hadn't been able to see through the window. She moved faster than anything human could move, crossing half the distance between them in the blink of an eye. Her black dress billowed around her like smoke, and her hair whipped wildly despite the still air. Her eyes were solid black now, reflecting the candlelight like polished obsidian, and when she opened her mouth, they could see fangs, long, white, and needle-sharp. "You dare return?" Her voice had lost all pretense of humanity. It was layered with harmonics, with echoes of something ancient and evil. "You dare enter my domain and steal what is mine?" David didn't hesitate. His hand was already in his pocket, and he pulled out the pepper spray, aimed, and pressed the trigger in one smooth motion. The stream of concentrated capsaicin caught Ms Vesper directly in the face. She recoiled, stumbling backward with a hiss of pain and fury. Her hands flew to her eyes, clawing at her face. For a moment, the boys thought it had worked. But then she lowered her hands, and though her eyes were red and streaming with tears, she was smiling. The pepper spray had hurt her, but not enough. Not nearly enough. "Foolish children," she snarled, taking another step forward. Her movements were more deliberate now, more predatory. She was done playing games. "You think your pathetic human weapons can harm me? I am centuries old. I have survived wars, plagues, and the relentless march of time itself. What chance do you have against me?" She lunged forward, her arms outstretched and her mouth open wide, revealing a throat that seemed to go down forever into darkness. "You will make a delicious meal," she growled, her voice dropping into registers that shouldn't have been possible for a human throat to produce. Young blood is always the sweetest. Luke's hands were shaking as he fumbled with the hairspray and the lighter. His fingers felt numb, clumsy, as he tried to get the lighter to spark. Once, twice. Nothing happened. Ms Vesper was almost upon them now, close enough that they could smell her. Something like old parchment and copper and earth from a fresh grave. The lighter sparked to life on the third try. Luke didn't think. He just acted. He held the flame in front of the hairspray can and pressed the nozzle with his thumb. The spray ignited instantly, creating a roaring gout of flame that shot across the basement like dragon's breath. The fireball caught Ms Vesper full in the chest and face. Unlike the pepper spray, this had an immediate and a devastating effect. Her clothes, that dark sweater and long dress she'd worn every day, ignited instantly, the old fabric catching fire like it had been soaked in gasoline. Flames raced across her body, engulfing her in seconds. Ms Vesper's shriek of agony was unlike anything the children had ever heard or would ever hear again. It was the sound of something ancient and evil experiencing true pain for perhaps the first time in centuries. She stumbled backward, her arms flailing, trying desperately to put out the flames that consumed her. "Run!" David screamed. "Everyone! Run! Now!" The 4 students who had been in the trance needed no further encouragement. Whatever spell had held them was broken now, shattered by adrenaline and terror. They ran for the stairs, pushing and shoving in their panic to escape. Matt was in front, taking the steps 3 at a time, despite his confusion and weakness. Mark and the girls followed close behind, their faces pale and streaked with tears. David and Luke brought up the rear, glancing back at the horror unfolding behind them. Ms Vesper was still screaming, still burning. She had fallen to her knees now, the flames spreading from her body to the old wooden floor, to the walls, to everything they touched. The dry, ancient house began to burn with frightening speed. Smoke filled the basement, thick and black and choking. The boys could barely see the stairs through the haze. They covered their mouths with their shirts and ran, stumbling over debris, their eyes streaming from the smoke and heat. They burst through the basement door into the main floor hallway. The fire was already spreading up through the floorboards, racing along the walls with unnatural speed. It was as if the house itself wanted to burn, as if it had been waiting decades for this moment of cleansing destruction. Behind them, they could still hear Ms Vesper screaming, though whether in pain or rage, they couldn't tell. The sound seemed to shake the very foundations of the house, making pictures fall from walls and windows crack in their frames. "The back door!" Luke shouted, pointing down the hallway to where they'd entered. Flames were already licking up the walls on either side, creating a tunnel of fire they'd have to run through. They didn't have a choice. They ran. The heat was incredible, searing their skin and singeing their hair as they sprinted through the burning hallway. Matt reached the door first and yanked it open, and they all tumbled out into the cool night air, gasping and coughing. They didn't stop running. They crossed the overgrown yard, pushed through the hedge that separated Ms Vesper's property from the neighbours, and kept going until they reached the street where they'd left their bikes. Only then did they turn around to look. The house at 1847 Blackwood Lane was fully engulfed in flames. Fire poured from every window, reaching up into the night sky like grasping fingers. The roof had already begun to collapse, sending up showers of sparks that floated on the hot air like malevolent fireflies. Even from across the street, they could feel the heat on their faces. And they could still hear her. Faint now, but unmistakable. Ms Vesper's screams echoed from inside the burning structure, gradually growing weaker and weaker until they finally, mercifully, stopped. The 6 children stood in a line on the sidewalk, watching the house burn. None of them spoke. They were in shock, physical, emotional, psychological shock that went bone deep. Their clothes were singed and dirty, their faces streaked with soot and tears, and small burns marked their arms and hands where embers had landed. Somewhere in the distance, they heard sirens. Someone must have seen the flames and called 911. Within minutes, the street was flooded with flashing lights. Fire trucks, police cars, and an ambulance converged on Blackwood Lane, their sirens wailing into the night. Firefighters jumped from their trucks and began deploying hoses, but it was already too late to save the house. All they could do was try to prevent the fire from spreading to neighbouring structures. Police officers began cordoning off the area with yellow tape, and paramedics rushed toward the 6 children huddled on the sidewalk. "Are you kids okay?" A young female paramedic knelt down in front of them, her face full of concern. "Were you in the house? Are any of you hurt?" None of them answered. They just stared at the burning house, watching it collapse in on itself, beam by burning beam. More adults arrived. More police officers, firefighters, and eventually a fire chief who began barking orders to his crew. Someone wrapped blankets around the children's shoulders. Someone else tried to ask them questions, but they remained silent, locked in their own private nightmares. Matt's mother arrived 20 minutes later, having been called by the police. She ran to her son, pulling him into a fierce hug and sobbing his name over and over. Luke's and David's parents came shortly after, drawn by the emergency vehicles and the news spreading through the neighbourhood. The 6 children were checked by paramedics, treated for minor burns and smoke inhalation, and given water to drink. Police officers tried to interview them, asking what had happened, how the fire started, why they were at this house. But the children said nothing. They just stared ahead with wide, traumatized eyes, occasionally glancing at each other in silent communication. How could they explain what they'd seen? How could they tell the truth without sounding insane? Who would believe that their substitute teacher had been a vampire, that she'd been feeding on students, that they'd had to burn her alive to escape? So they said nothing. They stayed silent through that long night, through the concerned looks from their parents, through the firefighters' efforts to extinguish the blaze. They said nothing as the house collapsed completely, leaving only a blackened foundation and smouldering rubble. By the time the sun began to rise, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, the fire was out. The house at 1847 Blackwood Lane was gone, reduced to ash and twisted metal. Firefighters walked through the ruins with flashlights, searching for a cause, searching for remains. They found nothing. No body. No bones. Nothing but ash. The 6 children were finally released to go home with their parents. As they were led to wait in cars, they looked at each other one last time. No words were needed. They had shared something that would bind them together forever, a terrible secret that they would carry for the rest of their lives. Epilogue. The official report concluded that the fire at 1847 Blackwood Lane had been caused by faulty wiring in an abandoned structure. The house had been empty for decades, the report stated, and should have been condemned years ago. It was a tragedy waiting to happen, though thankfully no one had been seriously injured. As for the 6 children found at the scene, authorities concluded they had been exploring the abandoned house, as children sometimes do, and had accidentally started the fire, possibly with matches or a lighter. It was irresponsible and dangerous, but understandable given their age. Their parents were strongly advised to have serious conversations with them about the dangers of trespassing and playing with fire. No one questioned why all 6 children had small, identical puncture wounds on their necks. The paramedics who noticed them assumed they were insect bites or scratches from their escape through the burning house. The school was informed that Ms Vesper had left suddenly due to a family emergency and would not be returning. Mrs Martinez came back early from her leave to finish out the last week of the school year. When students asked about what happened to Ms Vesper, they were told simply that she had moved away. No forwarding address, no contact information, just gone. For the rest of their lives, the 6 children, David, Matt, Luke, Mark, Sherry, and Lynn, would carry the scars of that night. Some were physical, small burns, the fading marks on their necks that never quite disappeared completely. But most were psychological, nightmares that persisted for years, an inability to trust substitute teachers, a fear of basements and fog and old houses. They never spoke about it, not even to each other. It was an unspoken pact, a shared trauma too terrible to voice. Sometimes they would catch each other's eyes in the hallway at school, and in that brief glance, they would remember. They would remember the cold, the fog, the black eyes, the screaming. But life went on, as it always does. They finished 7th grade. They moved on to 8th grade, then high school, then college. They grew up, moved away, started careers and families of their own. The memory faded, not gone, never gone, but pushed down into the dark places of the mind where terrible things live. Sometimes, though, on cold June evenings when a chill cuts through the summer heat for no apparent reason, they remember. They remember Ms Vesper and the house on Blackwood Lane. They remember the fog and the candles and the taste of smoke. And they're grateful. Grateful they survived. Grateful they saved each other. And grateful that some monsters, when burned, don't come back. The lot where 1847 Blackwood Lane once stood remains empty to this day. The city eventually cleared away the rubble and debris, but no one has ever built there again. Real estate agents say the soil is contaminated. Developers say the foundation is unsound. But the truth is simpler. No one wants to build there. No one wants to disturb whatever might still linger in that cursed earth. On foggy nights, some neighbours swear they can still hear screaming coming from the empty lot. Others report seeing a tall, dark figure standing where the front door used to be, watching the street with eyes that reflect light like an animal's. But these are just stories, of course, urban legends, the kind of tales people tell to scare each other at parties or around campfires. Aren't they? The end.